Hello, welcome to this week's video from Mr. Gill's Science Stuff and the next one in the Pathogens and Disease GCSE Biology topic. This one is obviously very timely, but it is just the next lesson in the scheme of work. So we won't be discussing too heavily COVID-19, although that is the reason why this is being recorded from home. So do obviously have a look at the other videos on the channel on COVID-19 if you want to know specifically more about that disease. In this one, we're going to talk about diseases in general and how we prevent the spread of pathogens in general terms, which could be applied to the current situation, but is not limited to it. So, this is the bit of syllabus we need to cover, that you should be able to explain how vaccination prevents illness in an individual, how vaccination works, and as well as how we control the spread of diseases and reduce spread within a population. Obviously very pertinent for now, so obviously a very timely lesson, but it is, as I say, a coincidence rather than deliberate. So, pretty obvious ones to start with, ways of preventing the spread of disease. Well, simple hygiene measures. You've heard an awful lot about these over the last few months. Washing your hands, and here we're saying between patients because this is intended for within hospitals or care settings, but it works equally well in the home or in general public settings. The use of disinfectants to destroy pathogens, not putting raw and cooked meat together in terms of some diseases, and other food hygiene measures that you can think of. Coughing into a handkerchief and then washing your hands, or, very important tip, if you sneeze or cough, then doing so into the crook of your elbow rather than onto your hands that you're going to touch something with, because unless, of course, you're into your sort of box dancing and your Cajun dancing, you don't use your inside of your elbow for much. And then, of course, the hygiene of people and agricultural machinery prevents the spread of plant diseases as well, because we can prevent the spread of pathogens in plants in much the same way. Now, a vector is a thing that carries a disease, so common ones would be things like houseflies, mosquitoes, aphids, that kind of black rats, fleas, that kind of thing. So mosquitoes, obviously, the most famous example would be carrying malaria, and if you prevent those from moving around or those from reproducing, then of course you're going to prevent the spread of that disease. And there are various ways to do that in terms of mosquito netting, in terms of pesticides, and there's removing places where they can breed, which is generally ponds and still water. Now there's another lesson in that on whether we should be doing that or not, because disrupting ecosystems to suit our own needs, but that's an ecology lesson and is a different topic. So you've also got isolation of infected individuals, a word we are all very familiar with at the moment in terms of isolation. If you keep patients with a disease or indeed people who might be affected in isolation, of course, they can't be infected. And then if you're looking in the world of plants, you've got small plants, e.g. crops can be destroyed or buried or removed from larger fields and various things. And then, of course, the bulk of today's lesson, vaccination. The best way for preventing disease spread in a population, full stop. So we're going to discuss more how vaccination works, a harmless form of pathogen being introduced into the body to prepare the immune system. So those are your main mechanisms for stopping the spread of disease. Okay, pretty straightforward, but you can be asked for them in an examination and within the context of a particular disease or example. So let's talk about vaccination. Now, you should have a rough idea how this works already because you've studied the immune system. You should have a knowledge of basic GCSE knowledge of how the immune system works and know roughly what is in a vaccination. Okay, but to put it into to recap it and put it in simple terms, it is a small quantity of a dead or inactive pathogen that's put into your body, often by injection. It can be orally, but often it's by injection. Now, the key exam tip here, please don't say a small amount of the pathogen, because if you give someone a small amount of measles, you've given them measles. If you give someone a small amount of smallpox, then you've killed them. Okay, so it's not about quantity of the disease, it's the dead or inactive bit that's important. So the pathogen has to be dead or inactive. And the key bit that needs to be intact are these things called the antigens, which are the shapes on the outside of the cell. So our next box there says the antigens in the vaccine stimulate your white blood cells or lymphocytes into making antibodies. A little bit more on that in the next slide. And antibodies then destroy the antigens and the pathogens that are attached to them without any risk of you getting the symptoms. Okay, so a few of those cells, about a quarter of those white blood cells you generate against the vaccination, stick around as memory cells. So if the real deal ever comes along, you are ready to produce those antibodies straight away. So we therefore refer to you as immune. right, to future infections by the pathogen, because your body can respond rapidly and make a lot of the correct antibody from the memory cells. Okay, so I'm going to go back to a modified version of an animation I showed you in a previous lesson, and it's in the COVID videos, which is this animation of how the immune system functions. So we talked about this, a virus entering your body. The virus has got antigens on the outside of a specific shape. Those are the red things on there. A particular type of lymphocyte, type of white blood cell, grabs hold of those, takes those off to have antibodies generated against them. Now, in a vaccine, we've actually not put the pathogen in because that would make somebody sick, right? What we've done is we've put some way of putting in just the antigens, or the antigens on a different virus, or a damaged or dead or inactive version of the virus or other pathogen. Okay, so it's just those antigens that are picked up by the lymphocyte. Okay, as a result of those, the correct lymphocyte against that disease is woken up, and they start producing antibodies. Now, of course, there isn't actually a disease for them to fight at the moment, so they clear the vaccine out of your body pretty quickly. We all know after vaccinations we can have a few little symptoms like the disease, but they don't last very long and they're not major issues. But those antibody producing cells are there and ready. Okay, so if later the real pathogen comes along, okay, then these antibody creating lymphocytes, okay, it's called B lymphocytes, are ready to very quickly produce, to wake up, clone and produce a lot of the antibodies. And as we discussed in the immunity lesson, what those antibodies do, they inactivate the pathogen, they glue them together, they can destroy them themselves, but one of the things they do particularly with viruses is called agglutination. They stick them together so that our big tough phagocyte can come along and consume the whole lot altogether. Okay, so that's how a vaccine works. You are priming the immune system, training the immune system to fight the disease for itself. Okay, so there are obviously little complications to that. How do we know that your immune system is going to respond the same way to an antigen that it did to an active virus that's actively infecting cells, damaging cells, causing disruption? Okay, and the answer is, well, we don't know that, and different vaccines work in different ways. It's why we can't just knock out vaccines to new diseases instantly, and it's why we're obviously waiting for a vaccine for COVID, which is being done in the same way as previous ones. And if you want to look at the Oxford study, there's an awful lot of good work going on there, but we don't know. We don't know that the antigens are going to produce a strong enough immune reaction until, of course, we test it. So if that doesn't work, your antigens don't produce the antibodies, then of course we don't get our strong immune response, and that's why we need to test our vaccinations. Okay, so how do they prevent the spread? So that's how they protect you, but how do they prevent the disease to spread? Well, if you are vaccinated, and indeed if enough of the population is vaccinated, then the disease can't spread through the population, because anyone who has a particular illness, who comes into the country with a particular illness or comes from an area where they haven't been vaccinating and has the disease, if they bump into you and you've been vaccinated, no disease transmission. Okay? Now, if enough of the population is vaccinated, then you don't get disease moving around within the population. Okay? And there are some people in our population who cannot, for legitimate reasons, and it's only a very small percentage, have vaccines, because vaccines rely on a working immune system. And if you don't have a working immune system, for example, you are recovering from certain cancers like leukemia, you have an autoimmune disorder, that kind of things, then the doctor may take the fairly extreme decision that you cannot take vaccinations. And therefore, if everybody else in the population is vaccinated, you get what's called herd immunity. Now, that's a term you might have heard Boris Johnson using incorrectly over the last number of weeks. Okay, herd immunity. If enough of us are vaccinated, enough of us are immune to a particular illness, then it doesn't have enough susceptible people to spread around the population. Okay, and I can show you a little animation of that, which goes like this. So we've got a little animation here, which will reset, hopefully. There we go. And which shows the difference between if you've got 0% of the population vaccinated, 25%, 50, 75, 90 and 95. So in this animation, blue is unvaccinated, yellow is vaccinated, and then of course red is infected. Okay, and as you can see, to achieve this herd immunity effect, you need a lot of the population to be immune, either by having had the disease or by having been vaccinated. So you will have heard the term herd immunity probably in the news over the last few weeks. However, the fact that it was considered as a strategy by the government was never really what this was supposed to be talking about. So bad misunderstanding of science. Okay, but hopefully when the vaccine's on the market, then we can vaccinate enough of the population to prevent disease spread. Okay, and that's how all vaccinations work. But as you can see, even at 75% vaccination, you still do get population-wide spreading of diseases. Okay, so we need at least 90% of the population to be vaccinated to achieve this herd immunity effect. Okay, so this is where we get into a problem, and I almost always can't resist going on a bit of a rant, a bit of a science rant in this lesson. Okay, I do enjoy this lesson because it is a wonderful example of where science meets public understanding and the problems that can come from those two. Now, I'm going to give you the evidence for this, of course, but vaccines work. Okay, they do. They are the most successful and most effective in both preventing disease and cost medical interventions that the human species has ever come up with. Okay, they have saved countless millions of lives. Okay, no ifs, no buts, they work. Okay, now if you don't get vaccinated, and you can be vaccinated, then obviously you're putting yourself at risk of various diseases, but you're also putting those vulnerable people we mentioned before at risk as well. Okay, so if you don't get vaccinated against a particular disease and you go into a school or a workplace where there will be people who are in that vulnerable group, you could well be carrying a completely preventable disease into an environment where people could be susceptible to that disease. They need to benefit from your herd immunity. Okay, so there are a lot of people, if you look on certain places on the internet, who have some pretty crazy ideas about vaccines and other things. Okay, talking about vaccines not working or being a conspiracy or being this or being that, and it is simply not true. The end. No ifs, no buts. Now you know that, and I'm going to show you the evidence and some of the common things that are said about vaccines. I want you to all go and spread the word. Okay, because you have now had this lesson in your GCSE and you are that bit more sophisticated as biologists to go and spread the word for public health. Okay, so let me give you some of the common nonsense, the common things you hear about vaccination. Now you know how vaccination works, we've just been through that. Make sure you understand how your immune system works and how vaccination works. Okay, common things you hear people saying, they're not natural. That's another one. Now this bothers me as a scientist because what do people mean by natural? Okay, not everything natural is good and not everything artificial is bad. Your smartphones are artificial. Most of your food has had some artificial input. Your clothes are artificial fabrics. So natural is not always good. Crocodiles and Ebola are natural. Doesn't mean you want them in your bedroom. Okay? Right, next one. You often hear this one, that they contain mercury. Right? Now, that may be true in some vaccines, and there are various chemical compounds all over the world that have atoms of mercury as part of a larger molecule. But what I'd say to that is, well, lots of things contain elements or compounds that if they were concentrated on their own would be harmful, but in context are fine. So for example, almonds and apples both contain cyanide. Right? Potatoes are related to deadly nightshade, and if the green bit is very, very poisonous. And salt, normal table salt, is half made of sodium. And if you get sodium on your own, it's highly explosive. So when you say they contain mercury, what's your point? Right? Doesn't make any sense. So next one, this one you hear quite often. Well, if you all have them, then I or my child doesn't have to have them. That really misunderstands the meaning of the word herd. Okay, now there might be reasons why people cannot have vaccinations, as previously said, but that is for a doctor to tell you. Okay, that's not for you to decide based on something you read on the internet. Okay, so I would say to those persons, stop being selfish. As previously said, you're turning yourself or your child into a walking disease spreader. Okay, we rely on high uptake of vaccines to protect the most vulnerable in our society. Okay, and that is absolutely necessary. So this one as well, humans have survived perfectly well for millions of years without vaccines, so why do we have to have them now? And my answer to that is, well, no, we haven't. No, we haven't, not at all, right? Millions and millions of people died of preventable diseases before the advent of vaccines. I mean, do you remember seeing a case of smallpox? No? Exactly. Okay? These are some of the things you will hear, and now these are some of the answers that you can give. Now, where does all this mistrust and misinformation about vaccines come from? Because most of the time, it's not the person you're talking to who may hold these views fault or their own original ideas, as it were. They've come from somewhere. Okay. Now, this was a really famous example where sort of anti-vaccine ideas came from. The MMR vaccine, and you could get a question about MMR on your GCSE. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples for both exam purposes and for your understanding of science. Okay, so this happened in 1998, and it's particularly applicable to people your age doing your GCSEs. Okay, it happened in 1998, which I know was before a lot of you were born. This man called Dr. Andrew Wakefield at the time, he published a paper, there he is, right? He published a paper which suggested that the MMR, which is a triple vaccine, which vaccinates against measles, mumps, and rubella, okay, which is German measles, he suggested that this could be linked to autism. Now, of course, as we know, autism is a collection of traits in a person's personality. It's a particular way of thinking, it's a particular way of behaving, okay? And everybody is somewhere on the spectrum, right, to do with autistic traits. Everybody is, okay? There are just people who are further down that spectrum than others. It is not a sort of transmissible illness. I would argue it's not an illness at all, okay? It is a personality character trait, okay? So the way he came to this conclusion was he basically got liver biopsy data, and he got that in a very dodgy way. So he managed to get the liver samples from 12 children with autism. And within their livers, he found traces of the MMR vaccine. And he went, all the autistic children I've tested here, all 12 of them, all dozen of them, have MMR traces in their livers. Therefore, MMR causes autism. Now, you can probably see the logical fallacy he's fallen foul of there, right? That is the equivalent of me taking a sample of 12 boys from any class, and seeing that they're all wearing shoes, and going, wearing shoes makes you a boy. That's not how science is done, okay? So he published this paper, and it did get published, but it was later retracted, withdrawn, and entirely discredited, okay? And it's not like the question wasn't studied. There were 21 other studies after his initial study to try and replicate his results, and all of them found that the MMR vaccination was highly effective, and I will give you the evidence for this in a moment, at preventing those three diseases. So it became retracted. So that sounds like a fairly standard story of science working the way that it should, right? A scientist puts out an idea, that idea is put out for peer review, and people said that's silly, and it got retracted. Okay, seems pretty normal. Meanwhile, however, okay, and obviously as a result of this, he lost his medical license in 2010 for the reason I'll explain now. Meanwhile, however, in the early 2000s, the media managed to pick up this story, okay, and they went wild with it. So the tabloid newspapers, print media, broadcast media went absolutely wild with it. They reported it very, very badly. They put the scare story out there amongst people, and they scared the parents of people with toddlers into thinking that they could be doing something damaging if they gave them the MMR vaccine. Okay, so of course vaccine rates dropped. Okay, and as a result of that, we're seeing more of those three diseases, measles, mumps, and rubella, now than we have for generations. Okay, well, since the 1950s, 60s. Okay, when vaccines were first introduced. And again, I'll show you the evidence in a moment. And this, I remember this story unfolding when this was at its peak in about 2002. I just started university, and I very distinctly remember seeing a news story where they were doing these little vox pops where they'd come up outside school gates and ambush people and go, "What do you think about vaccinations?" and things like that. And there was this one woman, and I'll never forget what she said, and I'll try and do a sort of a good facsimile. She said, "Nah, I'm not going to get my child vaccinated because I don't want him to grow up thick." Now, to me, there's three things wrong with that statement. Okay, firstly, vaccination. She's referring to autism, right? Vaccine doesn't cause autism. It simply does not. Okay, the evidence is there. It's been studied heavily. There was a Dutch study of 500,000 children, right, where they conclusively showed there is no link between autism and having or not having the MMR vaccination. So that's been entirely discredited. Secondly, this woman has clearly conflated autism with intelligence, which is absolutely wrong, right? In terms of academic ability, that sometimes autistic traits can lead to incredible abilities in areas of academia, right? So that's completely wrong. And I think if there was any reason that child was going to grow up thick, it's fairly clear what it is. So, moving on. These are some of the examples of some of the stories, and this vaccine, even though the paper was widely discredited, widely called out for being wrong, the story rumbled on. We've got a news story from the Daily Mail here from 2002. We've got a news story from the Sun here in 2007, and these stories rolled on and on and on, questioning the efficacy of vaccination, right? And here's the data, okay? So this is up to the early 2000s. So this is sort of just up to and just before, right, this controversy, right, this bad media reporting happened. As you can see there, the y-axis, we've got the cases of MMR. We've got the cases of measles, particularly in the UK, in thousands. So we've got back in the 1940s, right, and then through the 50s and 60s, we've got hundreds of thousands of cases of measles. Okay, so very, very common childhood disease. Lots and lots of people suffering with measles, and obviously a percentage of those people will have died from it. Then the vaccine was licensed in 1968. This was a single vaccine, and you can see what happens. All right, so 1968 is about there. Right, so you can see what's happened as a result of the vaccine being introduced, that the cases have dropped right the way down. Now, there are a few spikes where epidemics in particular areas of measles have broken out, but then obviously as the vaccine spread across the population, the amount of available people for the disease to spread through has dropped and dropped and dropped. Now, in 1988, the MMR vaccine was introduced, and of course, you can see we've had a further decrease down to a very, very, very low level throughout the 2000s, which obviously is great. Very, very effective, very effective mechanism, very effective control. Now, this is the harm that misinformation can do. This is the next part of that graph. So this goes, as you can see, from 1996 through to 2018. And you can see the number of measles cases in the UK has since, so it said early 2000s, so 2002, here's where I went to university. And that was when the spike was really, of people not being vaccinated, was really building up. And then, of course, the number of cases of measles has increased here. Now, you should see that the scale on the y-axis is very different. So this has not gone back to the way it was in the 1940s, 50s, but it is an upward trajectory. Okay, and the reason this is important, obviously, to you is this era here, sort of 2006 through to 2018. That's your lifetime. Okay, that's what's happening during your lifetime. So you may well have been at the centre of a debate whether or not to have you vaccinated, and I do suggest that you check. Okay, so the effect of the MMR, this is basically illustrating the effect of our MMR lies and panic, right? And this is your lifetime, as I say, and it's not thanks to any sort of change in the disease. It is all thanks to one bad doctor and a lot of worse newspapers. Now, this obviously has been discredited, but we've now moved into the age of social media. And to return to our common misconceptions, this is where social media, our influencers with limited medical training, have kind of taken over the baton. And there are still those people out there advocating vaccine-free lifestyles for various reasons. Okay, and that goes back to our common misconceptions. So, and of course, just to show you the changing of the tune, the Daily Mail, who were one of the leading voices in whether or not this vaccine was safe back in the early 2000s and questioning the efficacy despite medical intervention, have completely changed their tune. Okay, so this is from last year, 10th of October in 2019. This is basically a graphic that's come, which is absolutely true, absolutely correct. Thank you very much, Daily Mail. But there's no acknowledgement on their part that they created, in part, this panic. Okay, they created the problem that we're now experiencing. Okay, and I just like this graphic. This is Canadian data, so this is not in the UK, this is Canadian data for some other diseases, and shows the efficacy of vaccination. So vaccination has wiped out polio and diphtheria in most developed countries. There are only a few places in the world where you can pick up wild polio, so much so that you are no longer vaccinated against it. Mumps, chickenpox, measles, whooping cough, so on and so forth, have all been eradicated. Now, same with tuberculosis. You are not vaccinated against tuberculosis anymore. When I was at school, we all were. And there is a suggestion that because other countries are not following stringent vaccination programs, that disease is coming back, okay, which obviously is a concern for you. So, to summarise what we've said today before we stop, and then we'll do another video of how you would answer some exam questions on all these things. In summary, your methods you need to know: hygiene, destruction of vectors, and isolation. Right? Again, you should be very familiar with these from the situation we're in now. What vaccination is, how it works: we stimulate your body to make the right white blood cells against the disease antigens. Of course, what herd immunity really is, in terms of vaccinating enough of your population and you get herd immunity, which relies on the idea that you are all part of the herd. Okay, and then of course the idea that vaccines work, bad science reporting costs lives, and you could get what used to be referred to as a how science works question on the stories around vaccine efficacy and vaccine misinformation. Okay, so we'll stop there. That's the content. I'm going to do a separate video of how you approach the exam questions on this topic. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in a moment.